On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history and marked the beginning of a campaign that would shape the outcome of the Second World War. At first, the Germans seemed unstoppable. Their offensive divisions tore through Soviet defenses while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in massive encirclement battles, and German forces appeared to be on the verge of total victory. But the Soviet Union did not collapse as expected. Despite suffering catastrophic losses, their resolve remained unbroken. German casualties began to mount as their advance slowed. Just 20 miles from Moscow, the Soviets launched a surprise counteroffensive, forcing the Germans in retreat. It was Adolf Hitler's significant defeat in the war. So how did it happen? Why did Operation Barbarossa come so close to success, only to fail at the critical moment? Hitler's plans to invade the Soviet Union began as early as July 1940, long before the Battle of Britain had even ended. He had written about 80 years earlier in Mein Kampf, where he outlined his vision of expanding German territory eastward. For him, this was the ultimate battleground, where Nazi ideology would prove its superiority or collapse entirely. One of Hitler's central beliefs was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. He envisioned an Aryan Empire in Eastern Europe, with vast resources to make Germany self-sufficient. After defeating France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks, the Nazi leadership was convinced they could easily crush the Soviet Union in a similar fashion. The Germans planned a quick, decisive campaign, no longer than 8 weeks. They couldn't afford a prolonged war of attrition because their economy lacked the resources to sustain it. To achieve this lightning-fast victory, Germany amassed the largest invasion force in history, over 3 million men. They divided their forces into 3 army groups. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad. Army Group Center aimed for Moscow. Army Group South targeted Kiev and the fatal lands of Ukraine. The strategy followed the principles of blitzkrieg, which had worked so effectively in Western Europe. Swift, overwhelming attacks to destroy the enemy before they could organize. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the results were devastating. The Germans crushed Soviet forces at the borders, destroying the Soviet air force on the ground and encircling entire armies. Stalin's pages of the Red Army had left his forces poorly led, and the rapid advance caught them completely off guard. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were surrounded and captured. Unlike in Western Europe, Soviet forces lacked the mobility to retreat and regroup. They were overwhelmed before they could even react. By the end of July, German forces had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing Minsk and Smolensk. Hitler and his generals expected the rest of the campaign to be a mere formality, but they had severely underestimated the opponent. The Soviet Union's vast manpower and resources were far greater than the Germans had anticipated. By December, the Germans had captured or killed over 3 million Soviet soldiers, yet the Red Army was still fighting. Meanwhile, the rapid pace of the German advance created serious logistical problems. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and Soviet partisans began attacking their rear, disrupting the flow of food, fuel, and ammunition. Despite the growing challenges, Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow in August. Instead, he redirected forces to eliminate Soviet pockets near Kiev and Leningrad. This decision allowed the Soviets to regroup, to fortify Moscow, and prepare for a counter-offensive. By the time the Germans resumed their push toward Moscow in October, the weather had turned against them. Heavy rains turned roads into mud, halting German progress. Then came the freezing Russian winter, for which the Germans were woefully unprepared. Their tanks froze, their weapons malfunctioned, and their soldiers suffered frostbite in temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. By late November, German forces were just 20 miles from Moscow, but they were exhausted, they were undersupplied and vulnerable. On December 6th, the Soviets struck back. Stalin had secretly redeployed experienced divisions from Siberia, confident that Japan would not attack in the east. These troops, equipped for winter warfare, launched a massive counterattack that caught the Germans by surprise and forced them into retreat. Operation Barbarossa was over. Hitler's gamble on a quick victory had failed spectacularly. The Soviet Union's resilience, vast resources, and brutal weather turned the blitzkrieg into a war of attrition, a war Germany was ill-equipped to fight.